Okay, well, it's very nice to meet you.
It's nice to meet you too. I've been reading your book today.
And we're still talking. That's a good sign.
Well, come on now. Why would I judge?
Well, do you know there are so many people who do? Even though I have 3 pages of disclaimer that say it's an adult book, it has adult material, I use adult language, I receive irate emails sometimes from people who say, I can't believe what I just read. I'm so offended by it. And, the obvious response, Amanda, would be, well, did you not read the first 3 pages of the book? Because most people have a 1 paragraph disclaimer. I have 3 frigging pages. So come on now. But it comes with the turf.
Yeah.
And I did grow up leading a really rough life with a bunch of rough people. So my book is a reflection of the first 30 years of my life, which was rough. So it's a rough book. You don't like it? Give it to somebody else. That's my opinion. But thank you for starting to read it, and I hope you enjoy it.
Yeah. And I didn't want to come in not having like some, like a little bit of kind of jumping around and looking, but I hate reading books like that. And I wish that I would have had more time to just beginning to end, because I'm going to do that because there were enough stories as I flipped through that I'm like, okay, I kind of want to go back and read this now. Cause like, you had an interesting childhood, and I think that there's something to be said about how honest you are about your thought processes and the things that you were going through. And I think that there are some younger, people that will really benefit from somebody just being that honest about the way that they feel, or the way that, you felt growing up, and kind of, so that, I think that's a positive thing, even if people make it negative.
Well, Amanda, that's a very perceptive thing, because my book is really divided, if you will, into 2 parts. There's a narrative, which is the part that's most important to me. It's my story. It's my story going through addictions that included lying, sexual, being a thief, any kind of drug you can imagine, having a speaking disorder and refusing to talk for 2 years, realizing that I was gay at the age of 7 and coming out with the school system in 1957, not knowing what to do with me except call me a deviant. So the narrative is very important to me, because there are so many younger people now in the LGBTQ tribe that don't know how we got from there to here. And
Right.
a lot of us who remember when everything was a stereotype, you had to decide, am I a butch or a femme or a top or a bottom? But you had to pick one, kind of like, am I going to be a husband or a wife or a spinster? The 50s were weird that way. And there were comfort levels in having that stereotype, because you knew within the stereotype what you were supposed to be, do, and say. And when people like me started coming along, thinking a different way and breaking those stereotypes down, it frightened a lot of people. It frightened a lot of people in my own gay community, because one of the chapters in the book deals with my finding somebody who was gay, just hitting puberty, and asking them for help to meet other gay people. What do I need to do to be gay? And they dressed me as a woman and said, "You comfortable with that?" It's like, no. Then they dressed me like I was a member of a barbershop quartet, with gingham and, like I'm going to go out and cut a tree. Are you comfortable with that? No. Okay, well, are you a top or a bottom? To which I replied, I don't know what that means. To which they said, we can't help you. We don't know what you are. Good luck. Bye. And even the gay people threw me out, because they hadn't experienced a person who didn't want to be any of that. I just wanted to be me, and I knew that I was attracted to men, and I didn't think it needed to be more complicated than that. But for a few years, it was more complicated than that. And then I luckily found, on a city bus, a little brochure about the Gay Liberation Front, and a place in New York City called the Firehouse, where people went to just be gay. So I hitchhiked there while I was still in high school one weekend, and I found people who could help me, who could explain to me what was happening. And that was the very birth of the Gay Liberation Front and the breaking apart of stereotypes. I mean, Amanda, in some ways, I really happened to be at the right place at the right time for every seminal moment of my life, because I was there when GLBT stuff broke apart. I was there when straight folks decided that it was okay for them to be liberated sexually. You know, after the Continental Baths, which Bette Midler played at, that was the start of her success, and to which I was the technical director. After that went downhill, for reasons that I explain in my book, it got reopened by the mafia, but this time as a straight sex club called Plato's Retreat. And it was extremely popular in New York City with heterosexual men and women. And for many women, right around just after the burn your bra period, for many women, it was their first experience to be able to go and just enjoy sex and not have to attach it to a boyfriend or a lover or a husband. They could just go have sex. I'm going to go to Plato's Retreat and have sex. It was very liberating. And in those days, pre-AIDS, there wasn't anything that you could get that couldn't be fixed with a shot.
I read that in your little jump to the...
It's true. So we didn't have to worry about the consequences of having multiple partners. That came a few years later for straight people and gay people. So, you know, the Vietnam War changed my life. I was there in Chicago in '68. It was the first of many times that I got gassed. I was put into prison for refusing to fight in Vietnam when the draft board kept saying to me over and over again, Mr. Vass, all you have to do is sign this form that says you're a homosexual, and you won't be drafted. And I said, there is absolutely no reason why somebody who's gay, draft board, gay, not homosexual, can't fight just as well as somebody who's straight. So I don't want to not fight in Vietnam because I'm gay. I want to not fight in Vietnam because it's an immoral war. It doesn't make sense to me. So no, I'm not signing that. So I went to prison. Amanda, I had the best time in jail.
I laughed when I read that line. I thought, he's hilarious, because you started describing it and the scenery.
That was beautiful. I mean, now it's a 5-star resort, you know, in Napa Valley, surrounded by vineyards. But in those days, we grew tomatoes, and some people, if they were extra lucky, were taught a good way to grow pot. We must have supplied pot to half of San Francisco. Weekends, all the anti-war celebs would come, Joni Mitchell and Joan Baez and Bob Dylan and Simon and Garfunkel, and they would give concerts just for us, because everybody in that minimum security place was a political prisoner. In fact, we didn't even have chain link fence around us. We had like a 4-foot fence that you could step over if you wanted to escape. So it was more like a farm, and I learned how to farm. I had an amazing amount of good sex, because the majority of people who were there were straight men, but they were also horny men. So, you know, men, sometimes you just take what you can get. It's the old, I don't remember a thing that happened last night. It was that kind of thing. And so I was at a lot of crossroads during the course of my life. And until I met my partner of now 48 years, Paul, I pretty much did anything I wanted to do, any way I wanted to do it. And then it was a combination of falling in love with Paul, deciding to grow up and take responsibility for my life, and not wanting to be addicted to things anymore. That really changed me. I'm working on part 2 now of the book, which will be the second half of my life, because when AIDS came along and when Paul came along, my life changed radically, 180 degrees. But before that time, I was shot, stabbed, spit on, attempted to be run over, chased around West Greenwich Village with a gang with baseball bats. I mean, it wasn't all fun and games in those days. I really did what I could to fight for what I thought should be the rights of my community. I'm a little concerned now because some of our younger folks don't realize how close we are to having our First Amendment rights taken away again. And if you listen to some of the politicians these days, Roe versus Wade, nobody thought that would ever get overturned. Same thing could happen to gay marriage. So we need to be more on guard. People need to do less texting and more getting out in the streets because we're under attack. And that's not just gay people. That's everybody who believes in the First Amendment. It gives me no pride to say that my book is banned in 3 states.
Wow. Are you allowed to say which 3?
Yeah, it's, where's New Orleans?
Louisiana.
It's Louisiana, Texas, and Mississippi. I'm surprised it's not Florida because I just read this morning that 23 of Stephen King's horror books, he's primarily a horror writer. He's not a horror writer. 23 of his books have been banned from the Florida public school system libraries because they don't agree with the language he used in writing it. So
I'm so firmly against banned books. I don't think that. I think we need
the bigots.
I think we need better monitoring for children. If you feel so strongly, that your kid's going to stumble on this book, maybe have a little bit more presence in your kid's life and kind of talk to them about the things. And if they do end up with material that you don't agree with, sit down and have a conversation with them about it. Like, I don't understand banning books and trying to hide and shelter people from reality just because you don't like it.
Well, it's so true. And when you take on the responsibilities of being a parent, you really do, to some degree, need to police your children to see what it is they have available as their mind grows and what they don't have available as their mind grows. Let's put that, my mother said a couple of times to me in her drunken state, let's talk about that when you hit puberty. Because
I read that, yeah.
Even, that was, as weird and messed up as she was, that was kind of her way of policing me and saying, there's no point in having a discussion about that right now because you're either not going to understand it or you're going to misunderstand it. So let's do that later. And I wish more parents had that now. And I also wish more people, grown-ups and kids, Amanda, I wish that they knew that if there was something on TV they didn't like, or a movie that they objected to, or a book that they didn't want to read, I don't see anybody standing behind a person forcing their arm. So exactly. Turn the channel, put the book down. It's not hard. It's really not hard. And let every other person that wants to have their First Amendment rights have them. And then you get to have yours too. Yeah. But if you start picking and choosing who gets to have First Amendment rights and who doesn't, then we're no longer a democracy. We are,
It's true. I have a 10-year-old little boy. So reading your beginning and kind of when you were talking about what love was, and I read that with such a tender heart because, I was thinking like, are these things that my son thinks maybe he feels like I don't, engage with him enough, or like, and even though I know that I make an effort to do that, like, I do want you to know that from a mom's perspective, I think that this book is going to be a little eye-opening and maybe even kind of make you question yourself a little bit more. So that is also something very positive that I feel like will come out of it.
Well, I'm sure that you're a really good mother because you obviously have sensitivity. My mom's problem was I came 10 years later than her last child. I was the 7th child, 10 years after everybody else. And she thought she was never going to have to be a mother again. And
you were the oops.
Yeah, I was the broken condom. And suddenly there I was, and she had to deal with it. And a part of her was resentful. She tried not to be. She tried to be a good mom in her own way, but she was over it.
Mm-hmm.
And none of my brothers and sisters wanted anything to do with me because they were busy dating or wanting to join the military or do anything to get out of an abusive house because my father was not nice to them. He was abusive. So, and my mother really looked after me as best she could, but I knew, I could feel she didn't really want me. I was a responsibility that was a mistake. And it's a very different situation than, I mean, your kid doesn't have that situation. So don't worry, you're going to be, I'm sure you're a great mom.
I think the single mom part of it always puts that in your mind too, because I feel like, the latchkey kid thing and like thinking about that. And it just makes you, really think about things. And I think maybe little stuff like, he doesn't like to ride the bus in the mornings and because it's a really long ride. So I just drive him to school. And I always try to think about little things that, affect him in, different ways. And I don't know, it was cool to have your perspective on how, even as a mom, because I'm sure your mom thought she was just doing the best that she could and with what she had, and I think that's something we all kind of feel like sometimes. So
when my mom thought, I mean, she had discovered something, a pill called Miltown, which was a precursor to Valium. And it was easy to get because any doctor would prescribe it for you because she was nervous. So my mother was in an altered state between alcohol and pills from before I was born until she died, until way after I left home. So a lot of the time she didn't have a sense of responsibility because she was in an altered state. That happens with some people. That's why I think that my coming so honest, so clean about addictions and how many I've had. And I think it's important for people who have addictive personalities to know that there's hope and also to know that it can go really wrong. And once again, it's in your hands. You have to have enough maturity to know when you've gone too far and to know when you're just experimenting. I'm all for kids experimenting.
right.
But you can go too far, and that's where somebody like you as a parent needs to step in and say, wait, like let's revisit your moral compass.
Yeah.
I never had one. I was never given that compass. I did not know right from wrong, and I didn't care. And nobody corrected me until I was well in my 20s. So interesting stuff for people who want to look at the narrative part. And then my editor, I started telling her some stories about my show business years because I only put a few celebs in the book, like Anita O'Day, who was really kind of my second mother, and Ella Fitzgerald, and how everybody told her she was so ugly that she developed a terrible complex about being on stage.
And she had a wonderful skin.
Oh my God, she's
not
a
ugly.
beautiful woman.
I know.
mean, not in a normal way. She didn't look like Lena Horne, but not everybody looks like Marilyn Monroe. That doesn't mean you're
Right.
not beautiful, And when she told me the story about a guy who ran the Tropicana nightclub in Los Angeles, and an agent, she was up and coming, and an agent took her for an audition there, and he wouldn't even let her get on the stage. He pulled the agent aside and said, if you think I'm letting that get on my stage, you've got another thought coming.
Wow.
And she had 4 albums under her belt, but he did not want what he said, I'm not going to have some ugly N-word on my stage. So he was a racist. He was the brother-in-law of Harry the Horse, so he could get away with it because the mafia was not racist. but they also left their own alone.
Right. That,
And I don't know if you read this part of the book, but you know how Ella ended up getting that 10-day gig? Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe heard about it and was a huge fan of Ella Fitzgerald, although they'd never met.
aw.
She got in touch with Ella and she said, I want you to play that room. I'm sorry that you were embarrassed by that horrible man, but I think we can teach him a lesson. And Ella said, this was Ella telling me backstage between shows. I said, well, how are we going to do that? I mean, thank you, and it's wonderful to meet you, and I love your movies, but how are we going to do that? And she said, I'm going to call him and tell him that I want a ringside table for every single show, and I'll be there with press if he books you for 10 nights. And she did. And every show sold out.
I love Marilyn Monroe.
6 months later, he was found face down in a river. Was it the mafia that got him? Was it somebody else that got him? That will be one of a little mystery, like Jimmy Hoffa.
Yeah.
But Marilyn Monroe half the time wouldn't show up for movies.
Yeah.
Like, where's
She
Marilyn?
was her own addictions.
She was there for all 20 of those shows, sitting ringside. There were pictures of it. Isn't that a great story?
Yes, that's a wonderful story. I love Marilyn Monroe, and she just got such a hard way to go because no one ever gave her the support that she needed for her mental health. And
Was an orphan with no mother. So
yeah,
she didn't have a moral compass either.
yeah, and I think she kind of wanted so badly to be loved that she was used more often than not. So yeah. That's such a sad in
And
itself.
Amanda, in those days, I mean, I can't tell you when I was in show business, the amount of women that I saw being manipulated and abused. And they knew it. And they knew that they weren't going to get that album, that they weren't going to be able to play the Fairmont Circle, that they weren't going to get a gig in an MGM all-black musical movie unless the casting couch came into play. That's how it worked then. And you either accepted it or you found a different career. It was very sad to watch sometimes, and there were a lot of very bitter people. And I don't blame them for being bitter. Lena Horne, who should have gotten the lead in the musical Showboat, everybody thought she was going to get it. The two stars that ended up getting it, white women, one of whom had to put on dark face to look like a black woman, and couldn't sing. She and the co-star, I've forgotten the actresses' names right now, actually went to MGM, to the then president, Louis Mayer, and said, Lena Horne deserves to have this role. I shouldn't be doing this role. That should be Lena's role. And he said, she doesn't have the box office and it won't play in the South. Can't do it. And they said, well, that's just ridiculous. Don't you think it's time that we, shook the walls? And he said, no, it's not time we shook the walls. This movie is about making money. You want to go shake a wall? Shake it on your own time with your own money. I'm not shaking any walls. So then he called Lena because she was under contract to MGM. And she had 3 more movies to make. And they would put her in bits of movies as a nightclub singer, unless it was an all-black movie. A scene that could easily be cut so that when it was shown in the South,
It didn't exist.
No black people. So he called her into the office and she thought maybe he'd changed his mind and she was going to get that role. And he said, you know what I want to do? I do feel badly. I'm sorry. Everyone thought the role was going to be yours. But here's what we can do. You can sing all the songs and then
Someone else will get to pretend like they're singing them.
Lip sync them. Mm-hmm. And Lena said to me, she said, David, I'm not a troublemaker. I never caused trouble. I was realistic. I knew how things were. But she said, that hurt more than not getting the movie because I felt demeaned by that. And she said, you know what I did? I said to him, let me think about that. And she said, I went back to She was filming a movie at that point, a small part. She said, I went back to my dressing room. I packed up my stuff. I wrote him a letter and said, I'm never working for MGM again, ever. And she said, I left and I started my nightclub career. I just decided I'm not doing movies anymore. And she didn't do another movie until about 25 years ago when they filmed The Wiz with Michael Jackson and Diana Ross. They talked her into being Glenda the Good Witch.
Yeah.
And he sang Home, that song Home, so brilliantly. And that was the first time she was in front of a movie camera since the 50s because she refused to compromise her principles. Anyway, I put all of these. So there were some of these stories, like the Ellas and the Anita O'Days, I put in because they moved the narrative forward. Mm-hmm. But then my editor and then agent said to me, you've got so many interesting stories. You should put them all in.
So is that where we got Spicy Chapter 11?
Yep. We can do it as a bonus chapter, and we can not only can we sell the narrative, but we can also sell the gossip. And everybody that I wrote about, except for 3 celebrities, had already died when they made that offer to me. And I thought, oh, what the hell? I tell all these stories at dinner parties anyway. Why not? So I wanted the book to be a success. And this was my first book. And when you're a first-time author, nobody really wants to deal with you because they have no idea you're going to be successful or not. So I put it in. And it made the book a lot harder to sell because what is it? Is it a book for gay people about their history? Is it a book about addictions? Is it a book about a little boy with a speech impediment and nobody told him he had one? Is it a book about growing up gay? Is it a book about what a jerk Frank Sinatra was? What is this book? So it created confusion, and it actually hurt the sales of the book because some people bought it for one reason and didn't like the other part. And some people bought it for a different reason and didn't like the other part. So I learned from that I should have stuck to my guns because I suspected that there would be confusion around that. And having never written a book before, I listened to the quote unquote experts, and they were wrong. And I knew they were wrong, but they were the experts, and I had paid them money to guide me to try to make this book good because I needed.
Maybe that should have just been its own book, like the celebrity gossip part, because it is interesting. Don't get me wrong, there's always, everyone wants to read the stories. Obviously, I saw, that you had Eartha Kitt in there, and I'm like, I love her. Let me read this. And then I was like, it's another one of those, don't meet your heroes type of situations. And I love Frank Sinatra. And then I was like, oh.
Amanda, it should have been its own book because then they could have been more than thumbnails and I could have explained some things. Like a really good example is I loved Eartha Kitt too until I worked with her. But Eartha Kitt, when I worked with her, was in the middle she had an addictive personality. She was in the middle of a drug issue. She was drinking too much. Her career was tanking because of disco. She couldn't get gigs because if you weren't a disco singer, nobody wanted you. And she got mean when she drank. And she drank because she didn't want to play clubs that only held 400 people when she had done movies that were watched by millions.
Right.
So I didn't get to put that part in. The same is true with Frank Sinatra. He was a complete jerk to me, but that was one night.
Right.
I've heard stories from people of his generosity that I would love to have included, but there wasn't enough room in the book to do that the way we structured the book. So it turns out Frank Sinatra in his later years, by the way, was a jerk. Not just with me, but with lots of people. But he was one of those guys, unlike a Tony Bennett or a Bobby Darin. He was one of those guys who, if you were a person who the general public would walk up and want your autograph, he would do anything for you. you were at his level. He was your pal.
So he was respecting all the.
I mean, he would give you $1 million if you needed it. He was a for real pal if you hit that level. But if you were below that, he didn't want to have anything to do with you. He had a line in the sand where.
Which is interesting, given he was started because of the mob, and they gave him his leg up. So.
Well, it was, it was his mom who knew the mob. Her Betty was her fake name. Because he used to do illegal abortions for all of the mob's not wives, girlfriends. And it was through her that Frank got connected to the mafia.
Yeah.
So, there's a perfect example of a mother doing something horribly wrong that turned out so great for her kid. She had a hell of a career, and there are people to this day that when I meet them and they've read the book, just say to me, "You're just so wrong about Frank Sinatra. That's not who he was. And he really was a fabulous singer," and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But when you work with 200 singers, after a while, you kind of get to know who has a real voice and who is really masterful at using what they got. And he used what he got. Frank never had a good voice. He could not sustain notes. He had no vibrato. And he picked and chose his composers and most importantly his arrangers in such a way to hide the imperfections of his voice. He was very clever about his arrangements. They made Frank Sinatra sound like he could sing way better than he could sing.
Yeah, I think that was kind of common there too in that time, because even Sam Cooke, when they were talking about, he couldn't hold the note, so that's why he started to do the da 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 and like break it up because he couldn't hold the note.
Yeah, there were tricks, but most people, if they weren't flat out singers like a Lena Horne or an Ella Fitzgerald or a Sarah Vaughan, they would call themselves a song stylist. They would fess up to it and still be great because they would do what they would do, but Frank really thought he was a brilliant singer. And if you go through Frank Sinatra's history, you will find that people like Cole Porter, Ira Gershwin, George Gershwin started not speaking to him any longer because he changed lyrics so much. He'd have a couple towards the end, and instead of singing, "That's why the lady is a tramp," he would sing, "That's why the lady is a chick. Hey, she was a chick, man." And you don't do that. That's very disrespectful to great American songbook songs.
Yeah.
He just was very disrespectful to the lyricists towards the end. And
if you're going to write your own music, then you can take liberties on changing the lyrics.
Well, exactly. And there were some new songwriters who were desperate for Frank to sing one of their songs in the hopes that it would get some radio play, like Jimmy Webb and the guy who wrote MacArthur's Park. And so he started singing these weird songs because they were the only composers who would work with him anymore. And then he'd take the old stuff that anybody could use because the copyright laws were up, and he'd have it arranged in such a way to hide that his voice got worse and worse. And then he'd get tanked at night and change all the words around thinking he was funny. And Frank Sinatra was so adored by most people, by the public, quote unquote, that he could do all of that and be awful, and he'd still get a standing ovation. People were there to see Frank Sinatra. They weren't really there to listen. If they wanted to listen, they could put on an album. So,
fair. I think we can think of a couple bands that we could classify that way because they have famous people in them that no one really cares about their music, but they go to the show because they want to see the famous person that's playing in the band.
Yeah, absolutely. And in that kind of a scenario, Amanda, you have people who are getting work. That band gets work, even though the lead singer can't sing anymore because of the reputation. But when disco hit the music world, and Peggy Lee's and Ella Fitzgerald's and Sarah Vaughan's and Johnny Mathis's started having to reduce a 4-week gig to a 1-week gig and reduce playing a 3,000-seat theater to playing a 400-seat nightclub. That was because when disco hit, it hit huge. And it hit the same time that radio started to die. People were not listening to radio so much anymore. Walkmans were coming along. There were different ways to listen to music than there ever were before. You either heard it on television at one point, somebody played it on a piano, or you went to a ballroom to listen. So a lot of these singers lost their audience to disco. And a lot of disco, there were a few really good disco singers, like a Gloria Gaynor was really good. Donna Summer had a great voice. And the ones that were still alive after a little bit of time with disco, where did they go back to? They went back to the Great American Songbook. Look at Rod Stewart. Look at Bob Dylan. Look at Paul McCartney. What are they singing? The Great American Songbook. Everybody goes back to that classic sound when they, and especially when they start to lose their voice, because the lyrics will carry you.
Well, Bob Dylan's still performing, making music, and that's...
Well, his latest album is of the Great American Songbook, and I was so shocked when I saw it in the top 10 on Billboard, because it's really bad. I mean, it's really bad. And
I haven't listened to it yet.
Well, you can take your time. Just take your time with that one.
Well, I think something about Bob Dylan was he never cared about his voice anyway. It was never about his voice. It was about the message. So. Yeah,
and I don't know if you ever saw the Newport Jazz Festival. One of the years when Dylan performed was the year that he got rid of his acoustic guitar and went electric. And people booed him and walked out of the festival because they did not want electric Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan didn't care.
That sounds like a punk band name, Electric Bob Dylan.
Bob Dylan said, "This is what I'm doing now. You don't like it? Find a different folk festival. I'm not doing folk music anymore." And so he always stood up. He was always honest about what he was going to do. And I think he did this Great American Songbook album more as a tribute to the composers and the lyricists than anything else, because he's got so much money and so much power that he can do whatever he wants now. He could do a children's book and it would be a bestseller. I mean, he's Bob Dylan. He's like, when you reach that level, you get to do whatever you want. And chances are you earned it. Even Frank Sinatra, as much as I dislike him, he earned being iconic.
Right. Well, you got to put the work in.
You got to put the work in. That's exactly right. But you know what? It's I did want to give a shout out to Rita Cohn, who writes for Nouveau.
Love Rita.
I love Rita too. She's like the Energizer Bunny. She just doesn't, she just refuses to think about her age, and off she goes.
She's a magnificent writer.
Tasting, her dance reviews are astounding. That she can watch a 15-minute modern dance and turn it into a 45-minute article that goes back to its Greek origins. Just blows my mind. But a lot of the people who write for Nouveau are so talented. So that said, why don't we take a minute to talk about, for people who like your podcast, talk about where they can read your writings and where else they can hear you, because there will be people who listen to this podcast, I hope, and who like it. And I couldn't be talking to you unless you asked me questions and had this podcast. So if we want to hear more about you and read some of the things that you've written, how do we do that?
So for anything that I have touched at all on Nouveau, you'll find, because I also do photography, so you'll either find it listed under my name or Gorgeous Art Photography, and it's Gore, Gorgeous. So all that stuff will be in there. But it's weird because I don't talk about myself a whole lot, so I wasn't ready. No. Rock and Roll Globe was one of the other places I would publish. That's I have an article in there, but most of my stuff's in Nuvo. It's pretty simple, easy to find.
Would you consider yourself a freelance writer?
Yes.
Among other things. The interesting thing about publishing, I feel, is that you can't, you have to maintain constant visibility. And a person, unless you're extremely wealthy, a person my age doesn't have a lot of money to spend on visibility. Visibility meaning social media.
Right.
Everything is done these days by social media. That's pretty much it. And every week, Amazon puts out 10,000 new books. 10,000 new books a week go onto Amazon. So the competition is beyond fierce to just even get your book visible, much less sold. So it's a really tough time for authors right now, especially first-time authors, which is all the more reason why we need cultural support in the cities where we live. Nuvo gives it. Nobody else in Indianapolis that I've found could care.
Well, I think too, even if it's not your first book, if your name just isn't well known, it's still a similar fight, because I interviewed a ghostwriter who was writing her very first, actual book under her own name. It was Sarah Tomlinson. She did.
I know that name. She's a member of the Authors Guild. I've seen her post.
Yeah, so she wrote the book that was loosely based on the Rolling Stones, and it's The Last Days of the Midnight Ramblers. And so I interviewed her, and she was really nice, and that was something that she kind of talks about in the book, because her book, it seems like it's going to be about, music and this band, but really it's more about this ghostwriter and like her life, which is autobiographical in a way, which she explained when we talked. And that was something I think that, she kind of had to fight against, because she'd done all this ghostwriting, but you don't get credit for that, so she had to.
Yeah. You have to sign non-disclosure agreements, some of them for life, some of them for 5 years, some of them for 10 years. You notice that the ghostwriter for Harry, Prince Harry, is starting to be able to talk now, because his NDA, his non-disclosure agreement, is almost over. The guy who did the butler for Diana, the Princess of Wales, or whatever she was, he left now because his non-disclosure agreement is over. But Streisand's book, which sells for $70, anybody who worked with her on that, she claims that she wrote it all herself.
Interesting.
But have had to sign lifetime non-disclosure agreements. So they'll never be able to talk about it. The life of a ghostwriter is not an easy life.
Yeah, no, I was not envious of it after reading that, because I thought, how, because I talk to a lot of people, and every now and then people will get you in these conversations where I'm sure they've done it to you, because you talk about all these famous people that you've met, and so people want to know about that, right? And then if you can't talk about it, how crazy would that be, to just have all this, I met these really huge famous people and I actually know a lot of their secrets, but I can't say anything.
Well, Amanda, I'm so fortunate, because during the time that I write about, not a single one of the celebrities that I worked with wanted me to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Most of them probably didn't even know what a non-disclosure agreement was. It was like iPhones. They didn't exist, in the 70s and 80s. They started existing probably around the mid-90s, when people started having serious issues with drugs and whatnots, and Rolling Stone took a big step and reported it. But I happened to be friends with Patti Smith during the day in New York.
That's amazing.
And I'm
barefoot right now.
She is an amazing woman, and she's written an amazing book. But she was reticent to write the book, because she said, if I tell the truth, I'm going to mess a lot of people up. And if I don't tell the truth, I'm not going to like it.
Right.
So we had a really long talk about it about 10 years ago when I was in New York, and we hadn't seen each other in probably 15 years. And I said, Patty, what would Robert want you to do? Maplethorpe, the photographer, who was her soulmate, what would he want you to do? And she said, he'd want me to write it the way I remembered it and take pictures while I was doing it. And I said, you don't need a Ouija board for that. So she did. And she's been sued 4 times for that book because she did have a few non-disclosure agreements in place. But the book was primarily about her and then her reactions to other famous people that she knew. And that's a very different situation than writing about a famous person and not being that famous person. Mm-hmm. Because when you write a memoir, it is subjective by nature, and legally, as long as you can prove that you've done due diligence and that your opinion is to the best of your memory, a person can't sue you for defamation of character because it's the way you remembered it.
That's smart to, have that little bit of a loophole even.
Well, it's helpful for a memoir.
Yeah, for sure.
You're doing the kind of writing that is not a memoir. You really have to be cautious these days because, as you know, we live in a sue-crazy society. Everybody will sue anybody for anything.
Yeah.
Not just
so were there parts of your book that you wanted to put in that you did not put in? Is something that I like to always ask.
Well, I had 80 pages of my book that I had to edit out, and another 100 pages that I wrote a draft, and they said to me it's going to be too long. See, what happens is that...
So is that part 2?
Yeah. Well, no, actually, it's more of part 1. Part 2 is about from the time I met Paul, who I've been with for 48 years, through AIDS, and then I got out of show business and I put together safaris and very expensive programs for celebrities and rich people. I've traveled to 141 countries and 7 million air miles. Remember when Brad Pitt and Angelina, when they were together, she was having a baby and they wanted an entire village in Africa so that the press couldn't get at them? Uh-huh. That's the kind of stuff I set up. So it's a hell of a book. And it also has to do with a huge fight that I had with Mother Teresa, which when I say that Frank Sinatra was nasty, he was an angel compared to Mother Teresa.
Wow, what an interesting...
one nasty piece of work. So she had a hospice in the village for AIDS people, but in order to get into that hospice, you had to have your luggage searched. You got one room. You couldn't have a television. You couldn't have anything having to do with being gay. You couldn't have gay magazines. You couldn't have gay books. Your friends could only visit you for 4 hours a day, and the rest of the time the nuns prayed with you. More people tried to escape from her hospice. A lot of people didn't want to die in the hospital, and she was the only option. She and people like me that volunteered. I had a spare bedroom in the village, and I would let people come and die there because they didn't want to die in a hospital. It's very hard to talk about. But she was really nasty. And not long into her hospice, I confronted her on the street one day, not realizing that a person who was standing having a cigarette across from me was a writer for the New York Times. Had no idea. Just
never know where a writer's going to be.
Coincidence, And I just called her out. I said, what the hell is wrong with you? I used better words than that. I said, you have people coming to you because they're dying. They are gay. They have always been gay. They're dying right now because they were gay. And you're basically telling them that they can't be gay. They can't read gay stuff. They can't have their gay friends. They can't watch TV. What is this? A prison? You're running a prison. What the F is wrong with you? What kind of a saint are you supposed to be?
Yeah, you're punishing people.
I hadn't been sainthooded yet, but there was rumors. I said, you're rumored to be a saint. I said, not while I've got 10 fingers and 2 legs, because I'll be telling the truth about what you're doing over here. Now, I don't see you washing any feet. I also saw her once in business class on a long-haul flight from India to South Africa, I think. But I don't know. Maybe they just gave it to her because she was Mother Teresa, but she wasn't washing any feet in business class either. So I have a feeling that when book 2 comes out, a lot of the buzz about it is going to be what I think of Mother Teresa, because she was no saint. In fact, that might be the title of my second book.
Hey,
I want to mention that the name of my book is Liar Alleged.
and where can we find it?
You can find it on Amazon. You can find it on Barnes and Noble online. You can find it at RuPaul's All Store. You can find it on BookBub. You can find it on Goodreads. You can Google it and find it. It's not hard to find.
And the audiobook is available on Amazon Books?
It's on via Amazon, because Amazon owns Audible.
Okay.
So my book is on Audible as well. So if you go to Amazon or just Google me, you'll get to my Liar Alleged website, liaralleged.com, and that'll shoot you in the right direction for where you choose to buy your book.
Yeah.
I hope you do, because I could use the money. The LGBTQ history, which I try to do in a humorous way as much as possible, is the most critical part of the book for me. I would like that to be my legacy. People need to know where they came from. Otherwise, they can't appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, they always say you have to understand history or you're doomed to repeat it, right?
Well, yes, I haven't heard that in a really long time, but yes, that's a good one. That's a good chestnut.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. It was great talking with you.
Thank you. If I can do anything to help you in any way, I am an email or a phone call away. Okay?
All right. Yeah. And